So my presentation was on sustainability in regards to human ecosystems. And since the birth of mankind, we've been shaping the earth and its ecosystems to work for our benefit, which usually comes at the cost of all the other forms of life. And during the 17th century, humans were using around 5% of the land. But now, since the rise in modern industry in the 18th century, more than 50% of the land is being used for human settlements and agriculture, which has caused a massive environmental degradation. And as you can see in this graph, areas that used to be dominated by wild and woodland are now dominated by cropland and rangeland and urban areas instead. Because of these impacts, like some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have categories that specifically deal with sustainability of human ecosystems. Goal number 9 is about building resilient infrastructure and promoting sustainable industrialization. And this goal is key to finding solutions to environmental problems, but it also does it in a way that we can solve economic ones as well. And then goal number 11 is just specifically with sustainability of cities and communities. And I'll go into more of that in later slides. And then it also works on like sustainable design principles. And some of them include minimizing the use of non-renewable resources and using lower impact materials that are sustainably produced. Conserving and protecting resources like our air and water and soil, reducing waste and consumption, and creating impact measurements like for things like carbon footprints and making life cycle assessments. Around the 1800s, the percent of people that lived in urban areas was about 2%, but over the last 200 years, that number's grown to nearly 50%. And currently, cities are responsible for up to 80% of energy consumption and nearly 75% of global waste and carbon emissions worldwide. All this while only taking up about 2% of the Earth's surface. So that's led to a lot of deterioration of natural habitats and other high-value ecosystems, and has also increased pollution of air and water. So to combat these issues, urban areas need to be designed and constructed in a way that's more sustainable and environmentally friendly. One of these things is to be using those principles of design that I talked about and just structuring and applying these processes to make sure that the resources being put into these urban areas are efficient throughout the life cycle of the buildings within the community. Another aspect to consider is that when these areas are expanding, more often than not, the green spaces within those areas disappear. And increasing these green spaces not only like adds visual aspects to the community, but access to these green spaces is shown to promote mental health as well as physical health and reduce morbidity and mortality in these communities. These green spaces also help reduce harmful carbon emissions and turn making healthier and cleaner air within those areas. Another major area that needs to be looked at is that of transportation, as the number one cause for greenhouse emissions worldwide is our methods of transportation, which accounts for, I think, almost 30% of all emissions. And currently, only half of the world's urban population has convenient access to public transportation. And it's a key thing because it's one of the most effective ways like an individual can conserve energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in relation to transportation. As well, investing in electric vehicles for personal and public transportation can even further the conservation of energy and limit greenhouse gases, as electric vehicles have little to no emissions and help reduce the amount of smog and air pollution within the urban areas. This does come with the caveat, though, that electric vehicles obviously consume energy, and currently the bulk of our energy comes from non-renewable sources. So they do in some ways add to global emissions, but I'll talk about that in the next slide as well. And lastly, designing urban areas with increased walkability and bikeability can even further reduce the need for powered vehicles altogether. And unlike other sustainable forms of transportation, it just completely removes the need for outside energy consumption. And traditionally, we've relied on we used to rely on wood, but in the last 100 years or so, we've switched our energy sources to primarily use non-renewable sources like coal and petroleum and natural gas. But these have been shown to have been causing unrecoverable environmental damage. Burning coal and oil causes particles to be released in the environment and in turn pollute the air. And as some other groups have mentioned, air pollution is a major problem facing the world today, and it is primarily caused by burning these fuels, as well as it's obviously the main contributor to our current climate crisis that we're having. And while natural gas is more clean, they say, than coal and oil, some of the techniques that are used to extract natural gas, like fracking, where they use high pressure water to split rocks and release these gas deposits, have shown to cause many earthquakes in the regions where they're prevalent. And as well, the water and chemicals used in the process can leak into water sources and contaminate it, which will make it unsafe for consumption. So if we want to work on developing a more sustainable future, it's clear that we need to stop depending on fossil fuels as our main energy source, and in turn to clean renewable sources like hydro, wind, and solar. And from these charts, you can see that in the last 25 years that the use of renewable energy has become a lot more prevalent, but we still rely on the petroleum, natural gas, and coal as our main sources of energy. So we definitely need to hasten our use of renewables over non-renewables. More often than not, like, the upfront costs are higher than with renewable energy sources, but overall the renewables save more money in the long term due to not requiring traditional fuels. And as well, the maintenance requirements for renewable energy technologies are usually a lot lower than their non-renewable counterparts. There's little to no emissions with the renewable energy sources like solar and wind and hydropower, so obviously can help with our greenhouse gas emissions and help make a healthier and more sustainable environment. And then I just want to have the one caveat about nuclear energy is that on its own, nuclear energy is renewable, but the material that we use in nuclear power plants is not renewable. We have to use, most reactors rely on uranium-235, which is a very rare form of uranium. So that is not renewable. As well, nuclear power creates radioactive waste and can be very dangerous and is not as easily dealt with. But overall, it is considered a clean energy source. And then with agriculture, currently the most prevalent form of agriculture is industrial agriculture, which is characterized by overuse of toxic pesticides and industrial fertilizers, which cause issues like water pollution and been linked to a lot of illness and types of poisoning. As well, that's characterized by usually monoculture, which is just the practice of growing single plants or crops or livestock species instead of many different ones. And these monocultures often deplete the fertility of the soil, and which then we need to apply a lot of chemical fertilizers to replenish it. And they also degrade the natural structure of the soil, which leads to increased amounts of erosion. So a lot of new techniques have emerged in the last few decades to change the way we do industrial agriculture and just agriculture in general. One major thing is planting cover crops like rye and clover during the off-season times, which helps protect and build back natural soil structure, which prevents erosion. As well, it helps with weed control, which then limits the need for herbicides and fertilizer. Rotating and diversifying crops also helps improve the health of the soil and also improves with pest control. Using biological and mechanical integrated pest management instead of chemical pest management also helps minimize the impact that traditional agriculture has on the environment. And then more often than not, industrial agriculture keeps livestock and plants separate. But some new evidence has shown that if you smartly integrate livestock and crops, that you can help increase the efficiency of both. Whereas the crops provide easy access to food for the livestock, and in turn, livestock can provide fertilizer in the form of manure, which then again limits the amount of chemical fertilizer that would be needed to replenish the soil. And all of these ideas are in a new practice coming out. It's called regenerative agriculture, and those are just pretty much all that stuff I just talked about is within that idea of regenerative agriculture. And then this is my favorite part. I could have probably done my whole project on just this, and I put this in here, just because it's something I'm very interested in. It's not something I think that's practical to fix all the issues, but I definitely think a lot of the principles from Earthships can be integrated into how we build stuff. And they're originally designed by American architect Michael Reynolds, and he just did it as a way to rethink the conventional practices and theory within the profession of architecture. And they're a type of passive solar house that's made using natural and upcycled materials to just lessen the strain that conventional building techniques put on the environment, but still provide the amenities that we're used to. And they can be built in almost any part of the world and are relatively cheap in comparison to traditional home building. Nearly like 30% of energy produced in the world is used for heating and cooling buildings, but they use techniques of solar gain and thermal mass to maintain comfortable temperatures without the need for fossil fuels. They line the south side of the house with windows, and so sun is able to enter most of the house, and which heats up the walls and the floor, the thermal mass of the home, and retains it. So when the temperatures drop at night, that heat is released into the home. And then in summertime, when the sun is higher, the building naturally just stays cooler. And then you can enhance this by adding natural ventilation into the home, which is in the form of like buried cooling tubes and vents. Solar and wind are harnessed and stored in batteries, which can supply the outlets of the home. And with how they design the homes to be completely efficient, they use around 25% of the electricity that's needed to power a conventional home. And then natural and recycled materials are used throughout the home to limit the need for traditional materials. And like they use old tires as the base of the exterior of the home, which makes thermal mass, and it's pretty strong, and there's no shortage of tires. I think we have nearly 2.5 billion used tires stockpiled in the United States alone. I think we make about 2.5 million every year, so it's a good way to reuse that, and which a material that usually isn't able to be recycled. And then
Sorry to cut you off. We're about
oh
5 minutes over, so if you want to just quickly wrap up so we have
yeah,
to.
sorry, I knew that it was going to be. I tried to cut it down, but
It's
yeah.
okay.
But I guess the last thing I'll go on, this is my last slide, but my favorite aspect of it is the plumbing. They collect rainwater, which goes to the sinks and for bathing and doing laundry and stuff. And then that water is recycled and goes through planters in the home, and then it ends up in the toilets for flushing. And then once the toilets are flushed, it goes to a black water, or it goes to a traditional septic tank, which overflows into rubber lined cells outside the home, at which feed exterior landscaping plants. And this ensures that we're just using water more responsibly. And like I said, I don't think this is a technique that we could be just solve all the issues, but definitely could use design principles from this to help make the way we do things more sustainable. There's my citations, and there.
All right.